Hey, great to have you here. So today I want to talk about my top 10 favorite indie games. So over the last 10 or so years, I've probably dove more into indie games than I really have previously. Traditionally, I was fans of those big AAA titles, but honestly, over time, I realized I'd rather support a smaller indie dev. On top of that, I think indie games are a lot better games these days, and we'll talk about that a little bit further later on as well. And as far as my list here, two quick things to point out. Obviously, the number one is the list here is subjective. It's my own personal opinion. Your opinion may vary. I haven't played every indie game out there, so it's very possible there's some out there that I may have missed. On top of that, our opinions may just be a little bit different here and there, so keeping in mind this is my own personal subjective list. Second to that, as far as what defines an indie dev, I feel like that's also kind of subjective because there's some developers that have grown over time, and it's like, are you still an indie dev? You were originally, but I'm not sure you still qualify, so keeping that in mind, the list of what defines indie dev is probably somewhat skewed. I know I personally put a couple on this list that at first I was like, those aren't indie games, but I realized afterwards I'm like, yeah, they technically kind of are, so keep that in mind as well. So pretty much with all games, there's two real main components that I like to look for. One being gameplay, second being the storyline of things. I do tend to view indie games the same way I view songs. The ones that really make you feel something are really the most memorable over time. Before jumping into my top 10, I want to give some honorable mentions here. Kind of splitting these up, I mentioned story and gameplay are really the two main components you look for in games. So as far as the story side of things go, some honorable mentions, one being Firewatch. I never actually played this game, so this is a reason I didn't want to put it on this list. But I've watched people play it, and it's a great story as far as just dealing with grief and just your experience there. The ending is a little bit mixed for a lot of people, but I enjoyed the story progression, just the building up of characters we had there. Second on honorable mentions as far as story-wise goes, we have Night in the Woods. This is a 2D side-scroller with a lot of dialogue options and really is a coming-of-age story. And then third on the story side of things, The Wolf Among Us. I know Telltale Games has had some ups and downs as a company overall, and we were supposed to get a sequel to this. I haven't really checked in recently as far as that's still happening or not, but the original Wolf Among Us was a great story. It's kind of what you expect with a Telltale game with a lot of dialogue options, kind of a walking simulator-esque. This one thematically is kind of if you mix like Disney with a horror genre, so interesting concept there. And then jumping over to the great gameplay side of things for the honorable mentions. First one being Cult of the Lamb. This is a roguelike. I know people use the word roguelike and roguelite a lot interchangeably. I think the real difference is roguelike is permadeath, but either way, I'm probably just going to call them all roguelike and just leave it at that. This was a game that was really popular amongst the streaming community because I think you could have your own little camp and you can name pretty much your viewers some of the characters you have in your camp, and you can see them interact with each other. Some die off, some grow on to be really successful, so interesting component there to a game. Next up on gameplay, we have Darkest Dungeon. This one is probably one of the harder games where you're kind of going through a dungeon crawler type vibe, where you have characters that you've given certain skills and abilities, and you're trying to just progress and play through each dungeons over and over again, and ultimately get to the end point, but this one I really enjoyed. You have different classes and things like that, so it was a great concept overall. Next up, we have Rogue Legacy 2, another roguelike where you're just kind of continuing and platforming up and up, and you're gathering more things as you complete each run, and you're getting stronger overall and just progressing the story a little bit further, so your typical roguelike experience there. And then finally, one that may surprise people, For the King is one that I put on here. This is one that's kind of your typical like D&D board game type approach where you're doing turn-based combat, and you can do this with multiple people as well, where you have like a wizard or an elf or things like that, and you're just progressing amongst tiles, and it's kind of your typical board game D&D vibe to it. So if you haven't played For the King or any of the others on the honorable mentions here, definitely recommend checking them out. So let's just jump into the top 10 now. At number 10, we're putting kind of an OG here and going with Limbo. So this is your very typical, they've really expanded upon these at this point in time, have your 2D side-scrolling, kind of platformy where you're just progressing through the story going right and need to unlock certain things to keep progressing even further. This was one of the original ones. I think Playdead's the company that made this one. They also had Inside. You may be more a fan of that because it's more modern-based, I would say. But Limbo was the first one I played, and feels like it has more of a special place for me personally. The theme for this one's really cool. It's just pretty much a really dark, black theme to it where you're just progressing throughout the story. Little Nightmares is another one that comes to mind that has a similar type vibe as far as gameplay goes. But yeah, I really just enjoyed Limbo and the concept of this one, just kicking off this kind of subgenre of indie games. Not to mention the puzzles were really fun here, so you'd like go through one time, you would die, and you would see, okay, I gotta do something differently this time, and you kind of respawn and do it again, find the better way to go about it. There's actually one of the trophies that I wound up getting is like only die a handful of times, which was super challenging because the game's like, I don't know, a couple hours long, and obviously you only have a certain amount of lives if you're trying to do that trophy, so stuff like that makes it a little bit more fun for replayability purposes. But yeah, Limbo here comes at number 10. Coming in at number 9, we have Oxenfree. This one's similar to what I mentioned Night in the Woods was in the honorable mention side of things, where it's kind of your 2D side-scroller, dialogue selecting style of gameplay. So on the gameplay side of things, it's a little bit lighter. It's more heavy on the story side of things. And as far as the story goes, I won't get into too much details or spoilers pretty much for any of these games. but it's somewhat of your Stranger Things type vibe where you have this group of kids going to this island, and a lot of weird things start happening, and there's just a lot of sci-fi elements taking place here, and a lot of uncertainty and mystery. They wound up coming out with an oxenfree too, which I didn't enjoy as much personally, so I would definitely check out the first one, and if you like that one, maybe check out the second one, but the first one really shines for me. The second one, it's okay overall, but it's not as strong as the first. And yeah, just recommend checking this one out. If you're into story-based games, this is definitely one to keep your interest, and as mentioned, the gameplay, not as strong. You're pretty much just walking around and progressing the storylines. So keep that in mind pretty much with everything on this list. If you're really heavy on gameplay, I'll let you know if it's really into that. If you're really heavy on story, I'll let you know it's a good game for that, because some of these games do a little bit of both. Some of these games really lean to one of those. So this is one that definitely leans heavy into the story side of things, unlike Limbo, which probably more so leans into the gameplay side of things. Coming in at number 8, we have Overcooked 2, and pretty much either Overcooked game works here. I just figured I'd put 2 because the mechanics get a little bit more advanced, where you can start to throw things around and do a lot more special abilities there. So this game is, if you're familiar with it, it's pretty much your typical party style game. This is one at first when I was debating indie games, I'm like, I guess that kind of counts as an indie game, where you're pretty much just cooking food. So this one's heavy on the gameplay. There's a story mode they throw in there where you're progressing and doing each level and doing stuff for, like, I think King Onion or whatever his name is. But gameplay is really the focal point here, and especially with a group of friends. So this one is one that I pretty much highly recommend with a large group of people. So the concept is you have a certain amount of time and you have a certain score you're trying to get to as far as cooking food in a kitchen, and things get a little bit more harder as you progress further. So the room starts to move around, you make more complex dishes. So just a great time as far as a party game. Definitely need to make sure you play this with a group that you enjoy being around, though, because you can easily start to just yell at each other and just have friendships just broken from this game. It's kind of like a Mario Party type vibe, except you're actually all on the same team here typically. So in that aspect, it's more cooperative, but even still, you could be yelling at each other like, hey, get the rice, things like that. So it's definitely a fun game for that purpose, and definitely enjoyed it overall. Coming in at number 7, we have Death's Door. This is one that snuck up on me. I'm not sure a lot of people know about this game, but it's somewhat of your typical roguelike experience, hack and slash type game as well, where you're playing as this bird and you're just progressing throughout the story and getting more abilities and getting more weapons and things like that. And it can be pretty challenging when it comes to the gameplay side of things, because as I mentioned, it's a hack and slash type game where you're going in and slashing, rolling away. It almost has that Dark Souls vibe for a indie type environment. So really enjoyed it as far as the gameplay goes. And then there is some story there too, but I think the gameplay is really more emphasized in this one. And as I mentioned, this one is maybe a sleeper for some people. So if you haven't played it, if you like those type of games where you're progressing throughout a level and just hack and slashing away, this is definitely one to check out in my opinion. Coming in at number 6, we have Hollow Knight. So this one's kind of similar in gameplay style to Death's Door, although Death's Door is somewhat more of a top-down, and this one's more of a face-on view as far as a 2D platformer goes. And there's more of an interconnected world present here, whereas Death's Door, you're going into levels and doing things and coming back out to the main hub. This one, everything's pretty much connected to one main world where you're just progressing further. It's kind of your typical metroidvania game, I would say, if you're familiar with things like Super Metroid. This one's more of a modern take on that. Although similar to Death's Door, some of the combat and the fighting here is pretty challenging, so keep that in mind. It could get a little bit frustrating. I would say, in my opinion, metroidvanias are really fun games to play, but sometimes for me personally, I need to kind of hit my head against a wall a few times before I really start to enjoy it. So keep that in mind. If you're not enjoying it early on in the game, maybe give it a little bit more time to digest with it and see if you like it, because there may be some parts of the world that you go travel to and you're like, oh, I don't have the ability, I can't get up there yet, so I need to go back somewhere and find out where I need to go next. So some of that can get frustrating as far as not having really a guide or a linear path as far as here's the progression storyline of things. But once you start to unlock certain abilities, it becomes clear, oh, I got the flying ability or something like that, where you can go, I'm gonna go over here now and I can actually get on that ledge, or I can crawl under this. So that kind of stuff really takes place here. So as mentioned, if you're familiar with Metroidvanias, this is kind of your staple game for that. And I really enjoyed it and all the complexities it had here. I know Silksong, the sequel, is one that people have been talking about for a long time. I know I mentioned Wolf Among Us sequel is who knows. Similar situation here with Silksong. We're supposed to get this years ago, but they're still pushing it at this point. So hopefully at some point we do get the sequel, because Hollow Knight itself is a great game overall. Coming in at number 5, we have Inscryption. So this is one that also kind of snuck up on me as well, where it's a card game, but it's a roguelike game as well. So you're playing cards with somebody across the table from you, and you're doing things and getting certain abilities that makes it a little bit easier for you to progress. And each time you play a run, you get certain things unlocked, and you get better at figuring out, okay, this is the boss I'm facing. Here's how I need to beat this guy because he's going to do certain action, and this is how I get past that. So it's something you learn by just trial and error for the most part. And me personally, I'm a big fan of card games, which we'll teaser here, we'll find out later on this list as well. But that combining with a roguelike is such an awesome concept to me. And also having a story interwoven in this one as well. That's kind of the surprise here. You actually get a storyline in Inscryption that I wasn't expecting. I was expecting gameplay to be really the main component, which it's a main component, but this one, by no mistake, definitely has story as a big factor to it. In fact, I won't spoil too much, but when you get to a certain point in the gameplay style changes dramatically, and you're playing kind of a different style game, so kind of an interesting component there. And I enjoyed, for the most part, the first half of the game a little bit more as far as the gameplay style, but both parts have earned their place, and after you beat the game, you actually can play both components going forward, so that replayability option is there. I've just really enjoyed the story and mainly the gameplay overall with this one. So coming in at number 4, this is another one that I debated. Is this one that really qualifies as an indie game? Because the developer's an indie company, but it's being published by a bigger company. So at number 4, we have It Takes Two. So Hazelight Studios is the one that developed this game, but EA Originals was like the group that actually pushed the game out there. So kind of debated with this one. I don't think it was even nominated for Indie Game of the year it came out. It actually won Game of the Year, which was awesome to see, but that's kind of where the gray area where I'm like, I don't know if this counts, because I think Hazelight even has like 60 plus employees at this point. So with that in mind, I'm like, I don't know, but because I enjoyed the game so much, I wanted to make sure I included it here. So as far as the theme of this game, you have kind of a couple with a child, and the couple's fighting, and you can tell they're probably going to get divorced sometime in the near term. And their daughter winds up getting upset and winds up turning the parents into the dolls of the child. So you play the entire game from the perspective of each of the dolls. And with that comes a great game overall. So Hazelight does a really incredible job overall with creating great co-op experiences that you can play locally or online. And they really knock it out of the park here as well. I know A Way Out is one previously that they released and did a great job there. They're coming out with another game with a similar style in the future as well. And they've really just perfected this craft. So as far as the gameplay goes, you have so many different gameplay styles that you have here. You have a platformer at one point, then you have a side scroller at one point, then you have a shooter at one point, then you have a hack and slash. They have so many different gameplay styles thrown into this one experience. On top of that, they have an incredible story here. So you're obviously playing as these two little dolls with these fighting parents, and there's some definitely emotional scenes with some of these stuffed animals that you interact with. So as mentioned, I won't spoil anything, but does a really incredible job as far as combining that element of gameplay plus storyline to a perfect level. And honestly, I could see some people saying this was their favorite indie game of all time because how well they did this and how well they've executed thus far. They've really made their own staple as far as creating these games, and I look forward to seeing what they have in the future as well. So coming in at number 3, these top 3, if I'm being honest, I could have probably listed these in any order depending on the day, and I'm a little bit torn on where I put these in the top 3, so keep that in mind with these top 3. Number 3 on any given day could be number 1 for a lot of people, even for me personally. So number 3, we're going to go with Celeste. So this is an awesome game. I definitely recommend checking this one out if you're not familiar with it. But it's a 2D platformer and a pretty difficult one in that you have to do a lot of jumping back and forth. It's kind of like a Super Meat Boy style where you have so much stamina and you have to progress throughout the level without dying. If you die, though, you wind up just starting at the level again. So not too bad as far as where they kick you back to for a respawn. But on top of that, they have a really great story here as well. So the storyline is pretty much you have this girl who is progressing up this hill, and it's kind of symbolic of her mental health and just the struggles that people may have with mental health. And she's climbing up the mountain, and there's definitely times where she falls back down the mountain, and she needs to get that encouragement to keep going. And there's different characters you interact with along the way. So really great metaphor and just great overall theme and storyline that accompany this pretty challenging 2D platformer. At number 2, we have my favorite roguelike hack and slash style game, and that's Hades. This is one that has a sequel in early access now as well, so look forward to having Hades 2 come out. There's really not much that can be said about this game. Just an awesome gameplay style where you're having different spells and weapons that you're going through and progressing through a story where you're pretty much, the point of the game is that you are playing as Hades' son and you're trying to escape from hell. So you're going through different levels and facing different bosses to try to get out of hell ultimately. And each time you play, you may wind up dying, but on top of that, you wind up getting new abilities that you can unlock and pay with currency, and then use different weapons and different styles and different challenges that you can throw in to make the game more difficult. So really just great from a replayability standpoint as far as different mechanics that get thrown in here and there. And it has a great story as well. So this, Celeste, It Takes Two, Inscryption, all these ones on the top list have that awesome combination of gameplay and storyline. And on top of that, Hades has some incredible voice acting. Supergiant Games really uses some really incredible voice actors. So excellent experience in that department as well. So there's really just nothing you can really criticize when it comes to Hades. It's just awesome game overall. Once again, could be on the top of the list any given day, but we're coming in at number 2 here. So coming in at number 1, and it may be a little strange here because I mentioned gameplay and storyline are so critical. This game is pretty much all gameplay. There is a story there, but if I'm being honest, the story is not something I overly pay attention to. The reason it's coming in at number 1, though, is the replayability is the very highest of all these. I play this game constantly all the time, just jump back in for a quick game, and that's Slay the Spire. So I mentioned Inscryption was a roguelike card game style, and this is the same experience here. I enjoy playing this one a little bit more when it comes to replayability because it's so easy to just jump in, play a new round. There's just different characters you can play with. You can play with the Ironclad, the Silent, the Defect, the Watcher. This is another one where they're having a sequel coming out, so look forward to seeing that as well. And I don't know what it is about Slay the Spire, but it's one of those games that even after I've beaten it multiple times and I've unlocked everything at this point, I still go in and play another run. I put it on the max difficulty and say, hey, let's just do it again. See if we can do something a little bit differently here. And there's definitely things you could still learn along the way. Like, oh, that card works really well with that other relic, or that card works really well with that potion. Things like that, where there's combos that you can put together that you may not have seen before. So every run is kind of a unique experience, even though I kind of stick to the same strategy I use for a lot of times, like I'm playing the Silent. I always try to go shivs for some reason. I really kind of force that. I don't love poison as much with that character, but I know we're jumping into too much detail with that. But just overall, as far as if you like card games, if you like roguelike games, this one's an awesome experience to have. I know I personally haven't played Balatro. That's one I've heard really great things about, so it's very possible that would be somewhere on the list here as well. Similar style to that, I imagine. Not a poker game, more of a fantasy thematic game. But yeah, just really love this game, and it's one that I constantly play. I mentioned Hades has replayability, but for some reason, Slay the Spire is one that I come back to more frequently. It's probably because Hades, you have to make sure you know the exact mechanics in certain combat, and it can be challenging. So Slay the Spire is more of a thinking game, so you don't necessarily need to know the buttons and certain combat styles. You pretty much just need to know, okay, what's a good combination here? What's the boss going to do here? So it's a little bit less difficulty when it comes to actual, like, being able to use a controller effectively. It's more of a difficulty when it comes to being able to think logically and think about what's combinations that you can really put together to defeat the enemies. So that's my top 10. I'm pretty sure all these games on the top 10 list, I've gotten all the trophies or achievements, whatever you want to call them for. So that really adds to my point of saying these are games I really enjoy and really loved, because I spent enough time to say, hey, I'm not only going to beat the game, I'm also going to complete everything that you can do on top of the game. So just love the experience of all 10 of these, as well as the honorable mentions. There's probably some others I could have thrown on here as well. I probably forgot some here and there, so it's very possible there's something I really enjoyed, but I just slipped my mind as far as including here on this list. So let me know your own personal list down below. Are there any games that I didn't mention here on this list that you really enjoyed playing? Or are there any games on this list that you say, yeah, I love that game? Or maybe there's some games on this list that you really didn't get into and maybe could give a second try, who knows? Or it'd be awesome to see, maybe you haven't heard of some of these games, and by me mentioning them, you may wind up jumping into it and really enjoying it. So hope to see that as well. Just would love all kinds of engagement as far as indie games go down below in the comments. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.